The cruelest mistake a powerful man can make isn't choosing the wrong woman. It's realizing too late that the only woman who ever loved him has already learned how to smile without him. I didn't notice the first time Emily laughed that afternoon. Manhattan was drowning beneath a cold October rain, the kind that painted silver streaks across the windows of my Rolls-Royce Phantom, while traffic crawled through Fifth Avenue at barely 10 miles an hour. My attention belonged to quarterly reports, negotiations, and the endless stream of decisions that came with controlling an empire everyone believed ran itself. Then Marco, the driver who had served my family for nearly 20 years, quietly cleared his throat. "Sir," he said without turning around, "isn't that Mrs. Moretti?" I barely looked up. For one entire year, looking at my wife had become something I rarely remembered to do. But my eyes drifted toward the sidewalk anyway, more out of habit than curiosity. And everything inside me stopped. Emily stood beneath the awning of a small neighborhood bookstore, holding a paper coffee cup with both hands while the rain danced just beyond the edge of the roof. She wore the same navy wool coat I had once purchased because my assistant said wives appreciated thoughtful gifts. I couldn't remember giving it to her. I couldn't even remember whether she'd thanked me. What I did notice was the smile. It wasn't polite. It wasn't forced. It wasn't the careful little smile she used whenever I returned home after midnight, pretending exhaustion explained everything. This one reached her eyes. Warm, bright, alive. Across from her stood a man about my age, dressed in a charcoal pea coat, his umbrella folded beside him as though neither of them cared that the rain kept falling. He wasn't exceptionally handsome. He wasn't wealthy enough to recognize the watch on my wrist from half a block away. He looked ordinary. The kind of man I'd pass every morning without remembering his face 5 seconds later. Yet somehow he had accomplished something I hadn't managed in 365 days. He made Emily laugh. Not the restrained laugh people offered out of politeness. A real one. The kind that escaped before a person remembered to hide it. She tipped her head back slightly, covering her mouth as if embarrassed by how happy she sounded. He laughed too, and for reasons I couldn't explain, the sight tightened something inside my chest. My fingers slowly lowered the financial report into my lap. The city disappeared. The traffic disappeared. Even the rain faded into silence. There was only her, smiling, freely, like someone whose heart had finally stopped waiting. I searched my memory, trying to remember the last time I'd seen that expression directed at me. Nothing came. Birthdays blurred together. Charity galas. Anniversary dinners canceled because another meeting seemed more important. She had always been there when I returned home. Dinner still warm. Lights still on. A quiet, welcome back, floating through a house large enough to echo. I had answered with distracted nods, brief conversations, promises about tomorrow that quietly became next week, then next month, then another forgotten season. Somewhere during those forgotten months, Emily had stopped asking whether I'd be home for dinner. She had stopped leaving notes beside my morning coffee. She had stopped waiting by the window whenever my car pulled into the driveway. I hadn't noticed any of it. Why would I? I believe people who loved you simply stayed. That's what power teaches men if they're not careful. That loyalty is permanent. That affection survives neglect. That tomorrow is always available. Then the stranger reached over and gently brushed a tiny autumn leaf from Emily's shoulder. Such an insignificant gesture. Harmless. Respectful. Yet my heartbeat stumbled in a way no boardroom confrontation ever could. Emily looked at him with gratitude so natural it felt unfamiliar, almost impossible. Marco glanced into the rearview mirror. "Should I keep driving, sir?" I stared through the rain without answering. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at another man. I was looking at everything I had failed to see until someone else became the reason she smiled. I told Marco to keep driving, but my eyes remained fixed on the bookstore until the crowd swallowed. Emily and the stranger together. The traffic light turned green. The Phantom rolled forward. Manhattan continued moving exactly as it had 5 seconds earlier. Only I had changed. I leaned back against the leather seat and stared at my own reflection in the rain-covered window. 40 years old. Tailored charcoal suit. Platinum watch. Every ambition I had ever chased was sitting exactly where I had imagined it would be. Yet the only image replaying inside my head was my wife laughing for another man. I reached for my phone before I could stop myself and opened the photo gallery. Thousands of pictures. Charity events. Business conferences. Luxury properties. awards, private jets. My assistant had documented every milestone worth remembering. But when I searched for Emily, there were surprisingly few photographs. In almost every one, she stood slightly behind me, smiling softly while I faced the cameras. I had never noticed that before. My thumb paused over a picture taken exactly 11 months earlier during our foundation's annual winter gala. Emily wore an emerald green gown. I remembered the donors complimenting her elegance. I remembered closing a multi-million-dollar partnership that same evening. What I did not remember was speaking to her for more than a few minutes. Then another memory quietly surfaced. That night, she had waited until almost 2 in the morning with a slice of birthday cake because she had wanted to celebrate after the event. I had apologized, blamed exhaustion, and gone directly to my office instead. The cake had still been sitting on the dining table the following morning, untouched except for one candle burned completely down. Somehow that memory hurt more now than it had then. My phone vibrated. Daniel, my chief of security. Everything went well in Boston, sir. Contracts have been signed. I answered automatically. Good. There was a brief silence before he spoke again. Is something wrong? I almost laughed. Daniel had protected me through financial crises, political pressure, and more sleepless nights than I could count. Yet he recognized something was different simply because my voice had lost its usual certainty. No, I replied. Everything is fine. It was the easiest lie I had told all year. By the time I arrived home, dusk had settled over the estate. The fountain in front of the house shimmered beneath soft landscape lights while autumn leaves drifted across the stone driveway. The mansion looked exactly the way architects intended it to look. Grand, impressive, untouchable. It had never felt so empty. Inside, Margaret, our longtime housekeeper, greeted me with her usual warm smile. Good evening, Mr. Moretti. I loosened my tie. Is Emily home? Margaret hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Mrs. Moretti mentioned she would be having dinner with a friend tonight. A friend. Such an ordinary sentence. Yet I realized I did not know whether Emily had any friends at all. I had never asked. I walked into the dining room out of habit. The 12-seat walnut table was perfectly arranged, but only one place setting waited beneath the chandelier. Mine. For an entire year, I had assumed Emily preferred eating separately because our schedules were different. Now another uncomfortable possibility settled into my mind. Maybe she had simply grown tired of waiting. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and noticed something else missing. Fresh white lilies had always stood in the center of the table. Emily loved white lilies because she said they made large rooms feel less lonely. The crystal vase remained there, spotless and empty. Margaret, I called gently. She appeared almost immediately. What happened to the flowers? She looked genuinely surprised by the question. Mrs. Moretti stopped ordering them about 6 months ago, sir. She said there was no reason to keep replacing flowers when nobody noticed they were gone. Margaret excused herself quietly, leaving me alone with words that echoed far louder than the silence surrounding them. I looked at the empty vase for a very long time before I finally understood something I should have realized months earlier. Emily had not changed overnight. She had been disappearing one quiet disappointment at a time while I was too busy believing tomorrow would always give me another chance. That night sleep never came. I sat alone in my study while the grandfather clock counted each passing hour with patient precision, every chime reminding me how many evenings I had willingly traded for meetings that no longer seemed important. The city skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, glittering like scattered diamonds beneath the clouds. But for the first time since building my career, Manhattan looked strangely distant. My phone rested on the mahogany desk beside an untouched glass of espresso that had gone cold nearly an hour earlier. 3 times I unlocked the screen. 3 times I searched Emily's name. 3 times I closed it again without sending a single message. What could I possibly say after an entire year of silence? Around 7 the following morning, I walked downstairs expecting to find the breakfast room empty, just as it usually was whenever I left before sunrise. Instead, I heard quiet music drifting from the sunroom. Soft piano, gentle enough that I almost missed it. I stopped outside the doorway without announcing myself. Emily stood beside the windows wearing a cream-colored sweater and blue jeans, arranging fresh herbs into small ceramic pots. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, wrapping around her golden brown hair until it almost glowed. I realized something that embarrassed me. I had forgotten she enjoyed gardening. not expensive gardens designed by landscapers. Small herbs she could cook with herself. Basil, rosemary, thyme. She once told me that growing something with your own hands reminded you that beautiful things needed time instead of money. At the time, I had barely listened. Now, every word returned with painful clarity. She looked up when she sensed me standing there. For a brief second, surprise crossed her face before settling into the same calm expression I had grown accustomed to seeing. "Good morning," she said warmly. Not cold, not angry, simply polite. Somehow that hurt even more. "Good morning," I answered. The silence stretched between us. In the past, I would have glanced at my watch, apologized for another busy day, and disappeared into another waiting car. Instead, I remained where I was. "The herbs look nice," I finally said. Emily smiled. Faintly. "Thank you." Nothing else. No excitement that I had noticed. No invitation to continue the conversation. It was as though she had quietly accepted that our marriage consisted of brief exchanges floating through hallways too large for two strangers. Margaret entered carrying breakfast and set 2 plates on the table. Emily thanked her before reaching for her coffee. I noticed she still added 1 packet of raw sugar and a splash of oat milk. I had watched her do it hundreds of times without ever truly seeing it. "Will you be home tonight?" I asked before I could overthink the question. Emily looked almost puzzled. "I have dinner plans after work." There it was again. Plans. A life that continued whether I participated or not. With the same friend? Her eyes searched mine for a moment, perhaps wondering why I suddenly cared. "Yes. Ethan volunteers with the literacy program at the community center. We usually have dinner after the evening classes." Ethan. Now the stranger had a name. I nodded slowly, pretending the information meant nothing while every instinct urged me to ask another dozen questions. Instead, I watched Emily gather her tote bag from the chair beside her. A stack of children's books peeked from the top, their colorful covers worn from repeated use. "I did not know you volunteered," I admitted quietly. She paused at the doorway, genuine surprise softening her expression. "I have been teaching there every Tuesday and Thursday for almost 10 months. 10 months. Nearly the entire year." She offered a small, gracious smile before leaving the room. The front door closed gently a few seconds later. I remained seated long after the sound disappeared. 10 months. She had built an entire world beyond these walls while I believed nothing around me ever changed. For the first time, I understood that I was not losing Emily because another man had arrived. I was losing her because she had finally discovered the version of herself that no longer needed me to notice she existed. The rest of that week unfolded with an unsettling rhythm I had never experienced before. Every meeting felt longer than it should have. Every signature on every contract seemed strangely meaningless. Men twice my age congratulated me on another successful acquisition, while I found myself wondering whether Emily had remembered to water the herbs sitting in the sunroom. It was an absurd thought for someone whose calendar had once been scheduled down to 5-minute intervals, yet it returned again and again until I could no longer ignore it. Thursday evening, I left my office nearly 2 hours earlier than usual. Nobody questioned the decision. They simply assumed another confidential negotiation required my attention. In a way, they were right. I instructed Marco to drive toward the community center Emily had mentioned, speaking the address as casually as I could manage. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with brick buildings, small cafes, and maple trees whose orange leaves drifted gently across the sidewalks. It was not a part of the city I had visited in years. There were no luxury towers, no private clubs, no executives rushing between meetings. Life moved at an entirely different pace here. Marco parked across the street without asking questions. Through the windshield, I watched families gather outside the entrance while children hurried down the steps carrying backpacks and handmade art projects. Their laughter echoed through the cool evening air, effortless and genuine. Then I saw Emily. She stepped outside holding a stack of well-loved books against her chest. A little girl ran toward her, wrapping both arms around her waist before Emily laughed softly and hugged her back. The child's mother smiled with quiet gratitude before leading her daughter toward the parking lot. One by one, more families stopped to thank Emily. Some shook her hand. Others simply smiled. Every conversation looked natural, comfortable, as though she belonged there. I realized I had spent an entire year introducing Emily as my wife, without ever learning who she truly was when I was not standing beside her. About 10 minutes later, Ethan emerged from the building, carrying 2 paper bags from the cafe next door. He was dressed simply in a navy sweater and dark jeans. Nothing remarkable except the ease with which he approached her. He handed her one of the bags. Emily looked inside before laughing again. Even from across the street, I recognized the expression. Surprise followed by genuine delight. Ethan shrugged playfully as though whatever gift he had brought was not important. They began walking together toward a nearby park, sipping coffee while talking about something that required no performance, no careful choice of words, only comfort. My chest tightened with every step they took. Not because they stood too close. They did not. Not because they crossed any boundaries. They did not. They simply enjoyed each other's company in a way that felt painfully honest. Marco finally spoke, his voice gentle. "Would you like me to pull closer, sir?" I slowly shook my head. No. We remained exactly where we were, hidden behind rain-speckled glass while life continued only a few yards away. I watched Ethan stop beside a small street musician playing an old acoustic guitar. He dropped a few dollar bills into the open case before turning back toward Emily with an embarrassed grin. She teased him about something, and he laughed. A second later, she laughed too. I suddenly remembered the grand piano sitting untouched inside our mansion. Emily had once asked whether we could invite local musicians to perform during charity events instead of hiring celebrities. I had dismissed the idea because famous names attracted larger donations. She had quietly nodded and never mentioned it again. Standing there, I finally understood the difference between impressing people and connecting with them. Ethan had not given Emily expensive jewelry, luxury vacations, or a mansion overlooking the skyline. He had simply given her his attention, something that had cost him nothing and something I had never realized was priceless. As the two of them disappeared beneath the glowing streetlights, I remained motionless inside the car, confronted by a truth no amount of power could negotiate away. The man walking beside my wife had not stolen her happiness. He had only discovered the smile I had abandoned long before he ever arrived. When I returned home that evening, the house greeted me with the same polished silence it always had, but now I understood. That silence was never peaceful. It was accumulated absence. Every hallway echoed with conversations we had never shared. Every room carried memories that had never been made. I loosened my coat and walked slowly through the living room until I noticed a framed photograph resting on the fireplace mantel. Emily and I stood together on the coast of Maine during our honeymoon. The Atlantic stretched endlessly behind us, sunlight dancing across the waves. I remembered choosing the resort because it guaranteed privacy. I remembered taking business calls from the balcony every morning. What I did not remember was asking Emily what she wanted to do while we were there. She had been smiling in the photograph, but now I recognized that familiar expression. It was not joy. It was hope. Hope that tomorrow might be different. I picked up the frame, studying details I had ignored for an entire year. Her hand had been gently wrapped around my arm. Mine had remained inside my jacket pocket. Somehow the photographer had captured our entire marriage in a single image. My phone buzzed before I could place the frame back down. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered almost immediately. "Sir, I wanted to confirm tomorrow's meeting schedule." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" There was a brief pause. "Of course. Have you ever met someone named Ethan Brooks?" Another silence followed. "The literacy volunteer?" My grip tightened around the phone. "You know him?" "Only by reputation, sir. He volunteers at several community programs. Former elementary school teacher. His father served as a firefighter for more than 30 years. From everything I have heard, he is well respected." I waited for more. Surely there had to be something. A hidden motive. A financial problem. Anything that would explain why my chest felt so unsettled every time I saw him beside Emily. But Daniel simply added, "He seems like a genuinely decent man." Decent. The word lingered in the room long after the call ended. For years I had measured people by influence, intelligence, and ambition. Decency had never appeared on the list. Now it seemed to outweigh everything else. The next afternoon, I canceled 2 meetings without explanation. Instead of returning to the office, I drove to the community center alone. I remained across the street, unnoticed among parents waiting to pick up their children. Through the large front windows, I could see Emily sitting beside a little boy who struggled to read a story aloud. She never rushed him. Every time he stumbled over a word, she smiled patiently and encouraged him to try again. Nearly 15 minutes passed before he finally finished the page. The pride on his face could have illuminated the entire room. Emily clapped softly, and the other children joined her without hesitation. I found myself smiling before I realized I was doing it. Then Ethan entered carrying a cardboard box filled with donated books. Several children hurried over to help him unpack the colorful stacks onto nearby tables. He thanked every child individually, kneeling to their eye level as though each conversation mattered. Watching the two of them together revealed something I had been unwilling to admit. They were not escaping reality together. They were serving it. They were building something meaningful, one small act at a time. Emily glanced toward the window for just an instant, and instinctively I stepped behind a maple tree before she could notice me. The movement surprised even me. I had spent my entire adult life standing confidently in front of crowds, yet somehow I was hiding from my own wife. As I drove away, one thought repeated itself louder than the engine beneath me. I had spent years believing that providing everything Emily could buy was the highest expression of love. Meanwhile, another man had shown her that sometimes the greatest gift anyone could offer was simply being fully present. And for the first time in my life, I began to wonder whether the fortune I had built had quietly cost me the one person who had never asked for any of it. The envelope was waiting on my desk when I came home the following Monday. It rested neatly beside my laptop, aligned with impossible precision, as though even this final decision had been made with the same quiet care Emily brought to everything she touched. There was no dramatic note, no angry accusation, just my name written in her familiar handwriting across the front. Adrian. Nothing more. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at 8 simple letters that suddenly carried more weight than every contract I had ever signed. My hands, steady through years of difficult negotiations, hesitated before opening it. Inside were several neatly organized documents and a single folded sheet of stationery. I recognized the legal forms immediately. A petition to dissolve our marriage. My eyes drifted to the handwritten page instead. The words were simple, almost painfully gentle. I hope you never think this decision comes from anger. It comes from acceptance. For a long time I believed that if I loved you well enough, one day you would look at me the way I looked at you. I do not blame you anymore, because love cannot be requested like a favor. Somewhere along the way, I stopped waiting for you to come home, and I finally came home to myself instead. Thank you for everything you gave me, but I need a life where I am seen, not simply provided for. I sincerely hope you find happiness, Adrian. I truly do. There was no signature. She did not need one. I lowered the paper slowly, realizing I had expected tears, anger, or resentment. Instead, she had left me with kindness, and somehow kindness hurt far more than blame ever could. Margaret quietly appeared in the doorway, concern softening her expression. Mrs. Moretti asked me to give you those if you arrived before she returned. Where is she? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She is finishing classes at the community center. She said she would be home later this evening. I looked around the study and noticed small changes that suddenly felt enormous. One bookshelf was half empty. The watercolor painting Emily loved had disappeared from the wall. Even the reading chair beside the fireplace was gone. She had not packed everything. She had simply begun taking pieces of the life she had built for herself. I walked upstairs almost without thinking. Her closet door stood open. Several dresses remained, but the shelves looked noticeably lighter. The perfume she wore every morning was gone from the vanity. A favorite novel no longer rested on the bedside table. It was astonishing how loudly the absence of ordinary things could speak. Around 8:30 that evening, I heard the front door open. Emily stepped inside, carrying her canvas tote bag, looking pleasantly tired after a long day. She stopped when she saw the envelope resting on the coffee table between us. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she offered a small, respectful smile. You read it. I nodded once. Is this really what you want? She did not answer immediately. Instead, she removed her coat, folded it carefully over the arm of a chair, and looked around the room that had once been filled with hopeful expectations. It is what I finally need, she said softly. Emily, I can change. The words left my mouth before I had fully considered them. She studied me with remarkable gentleness, not disbelief, not bitterness, only quiet sadness. I believe you want to, she replied. But I also spent an entire year believing tomorrow would be different. Her voice never rose. She never accused me. She simply spoke the truth I had spent months avoiding. You are a good man in many ways, Adrian. You have helped so many people. You have built incredible things. But somewhere inside all of that success, we stopped being a marriage and became two people sharing an address. I wanted to argue. I wanted to promise her weekends away, candlelit dinners, vacations, conversations, anything that might erase 12 silent months. Yet every promise sounded empty because she had already waited long enough to hear them. Emily picked up the envelope once more and placed a pen beside it before quietly walking toward the staircase. She paused after the first step without turning around. For the first time in a long time, she whispered, "I am not asking you to choose me. I am choosing myself." The sound of her footsteps faded into the quiet house, leaving me alone with a signature I had never imagined I would be afraid to write. I did not sign the papers that night. I left them exactly where Emily had placed them, the pen resting across the final page like a question I was no longer certain how to answer. The mansion felt impossibly large after she went upstairs. Every light remained on, yet every room seemed darker than before. Around midnight, I found myself wandering through the house without purpose, stopping in places I had ignored for months. The music room still held the upright piano Emily played on quiet Sunday mornings. A thin layer of dust covered the keys. I pressed one gently, and a single soft note echoed through the empty hallway before disappearing into silence. I remembered walking past this room countless times while speaking into my phone, promising clients my complete attention. I had never realized someone else inside the house had been hoping for the same promise. Sleep never came. Instead, I opened a storage cabinet in my study searching for an old document and discovered a small wooden box tucked behind several folders. Emily had given it to me during our first Christmas together. I remembered thanking her politely before placing it on a shelf because another conference call had started 5 minutes later. Somehow I had never opened it. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside were tiny reminders of an entire year I had barely lived. Movie tickets from the first film we watched together. A pressed white lily sealed inside clear paper. A handwritten recipe card labeled, "Your favorite tomato soup," after you said it reminded you of your grandmother. I had forgotten saying that. She had not. Beneath those memories rested a stack of folded notes, one for every month of our marriage. None of them had been given to me. The first read, "Today you smiled at breakfast before checking your phone. I hope tomorrow lasts a little longer." Another said, "I know work is difficult right now. I believe in you even when you forget to believe in yourself." The final note was dated almost 3 months earlier. It contained only one sentence. "I think I finally understand that loving someone cannot replace being loved." I lowered the paper and covered my face with both hands. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I cried without trying to stop myself. There was no audience, no reputation to protect, no negotiation to win. Only the unbearable weight of realizing that the woman sleeping one floor above me had been quietly saying goodbye long before she ever wrote the letter on my desk. Morning arrived wrapped in pale autumn sunlight. I canceled every meeting on my schedule. When Daniel called, prepared to discuss contracts, I interrupted him before he finished his first sentence. Postponed everything for the rest of the week. He hesitated. "Sir, the board will have questions." "Then let them ask." The words surprised both of us. Less than an hour later, I drove alone to a small florist several miles from the estate. The elderly owner greeted me warmly before asking what occasion I was celebrating. I looked around the shop filled with colors and fragrances that reminded me painfully of the empty vase in our dining room. "Nothing," I answered honestly. "I am trying to remember something I should have noticed a long time ago." She smiled kindly. "Sometimes remembering is the first step." I bought white lilies. Not because flowers could repair 12 broken months, but because Emily deserved to know that someone had finally noticed they were missing. When I returned home, the housekeeper looked at the bouquet with quiet surprise. "Would you place these in the dining room?" I asked. Margaret smiled gently as she accepted them. "Mrs. Moretti will be happy to see them." I slowly shook my head. "No, Margaret. I am not doing this because I expect her to be happy. I am doing it because she should never have had to wonder whether anyone cared they were gone." As the fresh lilies settled into the crystal vase, filling the room with their delicate fragrance once again, I understood a truth that every achievement in my life had failed to teach me. Real change does not begin with grand promises. It begins the moment a proud man finally learns to notice the quiet heartbreak he once walked past without even looking. The following Saturday, I left the mansion without a driver for the first time in years. The morning air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the streets felt strangely peaceful without a schedule controlling every mile. I parked 3 blocks away from the community center and walked the rest of the distance with a paper bag in one hand. Inside were homemade blueberry muffins from a neighborhood bakery Margaret had quietly recommended after telling me they were Emily's favorite. She smiled when she said it, then admitted Emily used to bring a box for the children every few weeks until she decided to learn baking herself because she wanted the money to buy more books instead. Even that simple story reminded me how little I knew about the woman I had married. The community center buzzed with cheerful conversation when I stepped inside. Parents chatted near the entrance while children hurried between classrooms carrying notebooks and colorful drawings. Nobody recognized me, and for the first time in a long while I appreciated being just another face in the room. Emily stood at the front of a classroom reading aloud from a children's novel, her voice calm and expressive as every child listened with complete attention. She looked different here, not because of her clothes or hairstyle, but because she seemed lighter, as though each smile arrived naturally instead of fighting its way through disappointment. I waited quietly until the class ended before approaching. She noticed me almost immediately, surprise softening into cautious curiosity. "Adrian," she asked gently, "what are you doing here?" I lifted the paper bag slightly. "I brought muffins. Margaret told me they are popular around here." Emily looked at the bag, then back at me, unable to hide her surprise. "You came all this way just to bring breakfast?" "Yes." The answer sounded almost too simple, yet it was true. She accepted the bag with a quiet thank you before opening it. A sweet aroma of blueberries and cinnamon drifted into the hallway. Several children immediately gathered around with excited smiles. Emily laughed softly and invited everyone to share. Within seconds, the muffins disappeared into grateful little hands. Watching those children celebrate something so ordinary filled me with an unexpected warmth. I realized that joy rarely needed extravagance. It simply needed someone willing to think about another person before themselves. Ethan walked into the hallway a few moments later carrying another stack of donated books. He stopped briefly when he saw me, then offered an easy smile and extended his hand. "You must be Adrian. Emily has mentioned you." I accepted the handshake, surprised by his sincerity. There was no arrogance in his voice, no attempt to compete, only genuine kindness. "Thank you for everything you do here," I said honestly. Ethan shrugged with an easy grin. "These kids do more for us than we do for them." After excusing himself to organize the books, he disappeared into another classroom. I watched him go before turning back toward Emily. "He seems like a good man," I admitted. She nodded without hesitation. "He is." A few weeks earlier those words would have unsettled me. Instead, they forced me to confront something even more important. Good people had entered Emily's life because I had left too much empty space for them not to. We stepped outside together where the afternoon sun filtered through golden maple branches. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I took a slow breath. "I am not here to ask you to tear up the papers." Emily looked at me carefully, waiting. "I am here because I owe you something I should have given you long ago." She remained silent. An apology without excuses. I met her eyes without looking away. I kept believing that providing a beautiful life was enough. I never stopped to ask whether it was the life you wanted. I cannot change the man I was last year, but I refuse to become him again. Emily's eyes glistened slightly, though her expression remained calm. "Thank you for saying that." There was no promise hidden inside those words. No immediate forgiveness. Only quiet acknowledgement. Yet as we stood beneath the autumn trees while children laughed somewhere inside the building, I understood that real redemption was never about convincing someone to return. It was about becoming the kind of person who finally deserved the chance, even if that chance never came. 3 months passed before the first snow settled across the city, softening rooftops and quieting streets that had once echoed with constant urgency. During those months, I never mentioned the divorce papers again. I never asked Emily whether she had changed her mind. I stopped measuring progress by outcomes and started measuring it by the person I chose to become every morning. I left the office before dinner more often than not. I attended the literacy program every Saturday, never as a guest of honor, only as another volunteer willing to arrange chairs, carry donated books, and wipe dry erase boards after the children went home. At first, the parents recognized me only as the quiet man who always arrived early and stayed until the last box had been carried into storage. Eventually, the children began greeting me by name. One little boy proudly showed me that he had finished his first chapter book without help. A young girl handed me a drawing of everyone standing together beneath a bright blue sky. Emily smiled as she watched them surround me. And for the first time, I realized that respect earned through kindness felt infinitely greater than admiration earned through success. One snowy evening, the community center hosted its annual winter reading celebration. Families filled the auditorium with laughter, homemade cookies, and steaming cups of hot chocolate. I stood near the back helping fold extra chairs while Emily organized the children's certificates. She looked peaceful, confident, completely herself. That was the woman I should have protected from loneliness long before I ever tried protecting her from the world. When the celebration ended, we stepped outside together into the falling snow. White flakes rested on her coat before quietly melting beneath the warm glow of the streetlights. Neither of us hurried toward our cars. The city seemed content to let the silence speak first. Emily slipped her hands into her coat pockets and looked up at the sky. "You really kept coming," she said softly. I smiled. "Not because I hoped you would notice." She turned toward me with quiet curiosity. "Then why?" I watched snow gather along the sidewalk before answering. "Because somewhere along the way I discovered that becoming a better man should never depend on whether someone rewards you for it." She held my gaze for several long seconds. Then she reached into her purse and carefully removed the folded envelope that had rested on my desk months earlier. The edges were slightly worn from being carried so often. Without saying a word, she placed it into my hands. I looked down at the familiar papers before looking back at her. "I do not understand." Emily smiled, not with excitement, not with certainty, but with calm honesty. "Neither do I," she admitted. "I only know that the man standing in front of me today is not the same man who ignored the flowers, the dinners, and the quiet moments we could have shared." A gentle laugh escaped her. "I cannot promise what tomorrow will look like." "I am not asking you to," I replied. "Then let us stop trying to predict tomorrow," she whispered. "Let us simply not waste today." She reached for my hand, and this time I did not leave mine buried inside a pocket. Our fingers met in the cold winter air, not as strangers trying to repair the past, but as two people willing to build something honest one ordinary day at a time. We walked toward the parking lot together without speaking, our footsteps leaving a single trail across the fresh snow instead of two separate paths. Looking back now, people often assume the greatest lesson of my life came from power, wealth, or influence. They are always wrong. The greatest lesson arrived disguised as quiet patience, fresh lilies, children's books, and a woman who refused to stop believing in her own worth. I once believed love was something that would patiently wait until I had finished everything else. I know better now. Success may fill a calendar, but only love fills a home. And the rarest victory any person can ever earn is not convincing someone to stay. It is becoming someone worthy of walking beside.